The Coyote's Rest Saloon was packed that night, just like every other. The air was thick with sweat, tobacco, and cheap whiskey, creating a suffocating haze over the rowdy crowd. Men in wide-brimmed hats and dust-covered boots drank themselves numb, slamming their mugs against the tables, their laughter coarse and wild. It was a place for losers, outlaws, and men with nothing left to lose, where savagery spoke louder than any shred of decency. Behind the bar, Eleanor Ellie Carter, a young woman with tired eyes and a sharp mind, wiped down the tables and served drinks, doing her best to ignore the hungry stares and crude remarks that followed her every move. "Hey, sweetheart, hurry up with that drink," a man barked, pounding his mug on the table impatiently. His name was Frank Boyle, a gunslinger with a reputation for cruelty, especially when he was drunk. The others around him laughed, egging him on. Ellie kept her composure, placing the drinks down without a word. She knew better than to talk back. She had learned that the hard way. But Frank wasn't done. As Ellie turned to leave, he snatched her wrist, yanking her close. The saloon fell into a brief silence. Her eyes flashed with warning. She knew men like him all too well. "Where are your manners, girl? We're just looking for a little fun," Frank sneered, his grip tightening around her arm. The men around him chuckled, some cheering him on, others just watching to see how far things would go. Ellie tried to pull free, but Frank was stronger than he looked. Then, one of his drinking buddies, Jed Turner, a foul-smelling brute with whiskey on his breath, grabbed a full mug and dumped the drink all over her. The ice-cold liquid soaked her blouse, dripping down her arms, while the men roared with laughter. Ellie closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling sharply. Something inside her snapped. She was not just a helpless waitress. No, she had a past these men could never begin to imagine. When Ellie opened her eyes again, the submissive look was gone. In its place was something no one expected to see, a cold, calculated stare, honed from years of training under one of the most feared outlaws in the West. And in that instant, the laughter began to die, one voice at a time. A heavy silence settled over the saloon like a thick fog, choking out the laughter that had filled the air just moments ago. Ellie stood motionless, her wet blouse clinging to her skin, but she wasn't shaking in fear. No, something else radiated from her now. A stillness, a deadly calm, like the kind you see in a gunfighter's eyes just before they pull the trigger. The men around her shifted uneasily, sensing the sudden shift in the air, but Frank Boyle was too drunk and too stupid to notice. He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and bad intentions, gripping her arm even tighter. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Cat got your tongue?" he sneered, his yellowed teeth flashing in the dim light. "Or maybe you're waiting for a real man to teach you some manners?" The other men chuckled nervously, some of them starting to realize that something wasn't right. Ellie wasn't pleading, wasn't backing away. She was watching them, her gaze flicking between their hands, their holsters, the exits. Calculating. The moment Frank's grip tightened, Ellie moved. Faster than any of them could process, she twisted her wrist, breaking free with a sharp, practiced motion. Before Frank could react, her fist slammed into his throat, cutting off his breath with a sickening gasp. The saloon erupted into chaos as Frank staggered back, choking and clutching his neck, his eyes wide in shock. Jed Turner shot up from his chair, but before he could lunge, Ellie's boot connected with his knee with a brutal crack. He screamed, collapsing onto the floor as his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The onlookers scattered, chairs and mugs crashing as men scrambled to get out of the way. The bartender ducked behind the counter. The piano player stopped mid-note. No one had expected this. Ellie didn't hesitate. She reached behind the bar, her fingers wrapping around the cold, familiar grip of a sawed-off shotgun. The moment she lifted it, the sound of the hammer being cocked echoed through the saloon like a death knell. Every man in the room froze. Eyes darted between her and Frank, who was still gasping for air, his hand inching toward the revolver at his hip. "I wouldn't," Ellie warned, her voice low and even. Her finger hovered over the trigger, her stance firm. She wasn't bluffing. She had held a gun before. She had pulled a trigger before. And if these men didn't back down, she would do it again. And just like that, the laughter was gone. The arrogance drained from their faces. Because for the first time that night, they realized something terrifying. Ellie Carter wasn't just some waitress. She was something else entirely. And they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The saloon stood frozen in time, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Ellie's grip on the shotgun was steady, her finger resting just close enough to the trigger to make every man in the room reconsider their life choices. The only sounds now were the ragged breathing of Frank Boyle, still clutching his throat, and the muffled whimpers of Jed Turner, rolling on the floor with his shattered knee. No one dared to move. Even the bartender, a man who had seen plenty of bar fights in his time, kept his hands where Ellie could see them. Frank's fingers inched toward his revolver, his face twisted in rage rather than pain. He wasn't used to being humiliated, least of all by a woman. He was about to make another mistake. The moment his hand brushed the grip of his gun, Ellie tilted the shotgun slightly, and with a sudden ear-splitting boom, she fired. The blast wasn't aimed to kill, just to send a message. The bullet tore through the edge of the bar, splintering wood and sending shards flying. The entire room jolted at the sound, and Frank flinched hard, his hand stopping dead over his revolver. "Next one goes through your chest, Frank." Ellie's voice was calm, almost too calm, the kind that sent a chill down a man's spine. She cocked the gun again, the metallic click echoing in the silence. "Or maybe your head. Depends on how slow you learn." One of the men in the back, a gambler named Tom Wilkes, swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he whispered to the man beside him. "You don't get it, do you? You recognize her last name?" The man blinked, confused, shaking his head. Wilkes leaned in closer, his voice hushed but urgent. "Carter. As in William Carter." The name rippled through the crowd like a slow-moving wildfire. Eyes widened, jaws clenched. Now they understood. William Carter, notorious outlaw, bank robber, and gunslinger feared across 3 territories. A man so ruthless that even the most hardened criminals spoke his name in hushed tones. Ellie wasn't just some barmaid. She was his blood, his daughter. And if she had been raised by him, trained by him, none of them stood a chance. Frank's breath came out shaky now, his mind racing. How the hell had he not known? He had just humiliated, attacked, the daughter of a man who had put whole posses into their graves. And now, she was looking at him the same way her father probably had before pulling a trigger. Ellie let the silence stretch, watching the fear settle in their bones. Then, in a voice that was almost amused, she tilted her head and asked one simple question. "Still feeling brave, Frank?" Frank Boyle had been in plenty of fights before. He had stared down the barrels of guns, taken punches that broke his ribs, and walked away from shootouts that left other men in the dirt. But this was different. The weight of the shotgun barrel pointed at his chest made his pulse throb in his ears. But it wasn't just the gun that made his hands tremble. It was her name. The realization had sunk deep into the bones of every man in that saloon. Eleanor Carter, the daughter of William Blackjack Carter, a name whispered like a ghost story across the West. A man who had gunned down bounty hunters for sport, robbed more banks than the law could count, and walked away from every ambush set against him. Frank's mouth was dry as he slowly raised both hands, signaling surrender. But his pride was a beast that wouldn't die so easily. His lip curled, and despite the fear tightening his throat, he forced a smirk. "So what, sweetheart? You think because your daddy was a killer, that makes you one too?" His voice was hoarse, but the challenge was there. A last attempt to save face. He ignored the way some of the men around him flinched, as if just speaking William Carter's name might summon him from the grave. Ellie didn't blink. didn't flinch. She just stared. It wasn't the look of an angry waitress standing up for herself. It was the look of a predator deciding whether or not its prey was worth the effort. Slowly, she tilted her head, and the barest hint of a smirk touched the corner of her lips. "Oh, Frank, you have no idea what I am." Her voice was low, measured, a quiet threat wrapped in something almost teasing. And that was worse than yelling, worse than threats, because it meant she wasn't scared. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as the tension thickened. The bartender, who had been watching from behind the counter, finally exhaled a shaky breath and made the first move. "Ain't no need for more trouble tonight, Miss Carter," he said carefully, his voice carrying the respect of a man who understood exactly who he was dealing with. "Why don't we all just settle down? Let Frank and his boys walk outta here, nice and easy." The plea hung in the air, a desperate attempt to stop the bloodshed before it started. Ellie's fingers flexed around the shotgun, and for a moment she seemed to consider it. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned the barrel slightly, just enough to let Frank breathe again. But that cold smile never left her face. "You're right, Sam. There's no need for more trouble." A pause. "But Frank here still owes me an apology." Frank's jaw clenched, his humiliation plain on his face. The eyes of every man in the saloon burned into him, waiting, expecting. His hands trembled at his sides, rage and fear warring inside him. Apologize to a woman? A waitress? A Carter? His pride told him no. His survival instincts screamed otherwise. And so, with a barely restrained snarl, he spat at the ground and muttered through clenched teeth, "I'm sorry." Ellie tilted her head, as if deciding whether or not she believed him. Then, finally, she lowered the shotgun. A collective breath of relief swept through the saloon, men shifting in their seats, the unspoken agreement passing between them. No one would ever cross Eleanor Carter again. But as Frank turned to leave, his shoulders stiff, his pride shattered, Ellie spoke again. "One more thing." Frank stopped dead. The air went still again. He turned his head just enough to look at her from the corner of his eye. Ellie's voice was softer now, almost casual. "If you ever put your hands on me again, I won't just embarrass you next time." She let the words settle before leaning in slightly. "I'll bury you." Frank didn't say another word. He just walked, out the door, into the cold night, and out of Eleanor Carter's life for good. Or so she thought. The Coyote's Rest Saloon slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Drinks poured, dice rolled, conversations picked up again. But something had shifted. Ellie Carter had just rewritten the rules. No longer just a waitress, she was now a name that carried weight, a presence that demanded caution. Every man in the room had seen it. The way she moved, the way she held that shotgun without hesitation. She wasn't bluffing. And that scared them more than the weapon itself. Yet, as the tension faded, Ellie knew better than to believe this was over. Men like Frank Boyle didn't take humiliation lightly. Outside, the night was bitterly cold, but Frank's blood was boiling. He stomped through the dusty street, his hands balled into tight fists, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. Every step echoed with rage, the sting of public disgrace burning deep in his chest. He had been made to look like a fool, in front of everyone. And worse, by a Carter. The name alone was enough to make his blood curdle. He reached the stables, chest heaving with anger, when a familiar voice slithered from the shadows. "You just gonna take that beating, Boyle?" Jed Turner. Still leaning against a wooden post, his face twisted with pain from his shattered knee, but his eyes were sharp with hate. He limped closer, voice low. "I got friends, Boyle. The kind who don't much like the Carters. Mean sons of bitches. You want payback? We can make it happen." Frank stopped, his breathing uneven, considering. He knew he couldn't take Ellie alone. She was too damn fast, too damn good with a gun. But with the right men? A setup. An ambush. He glanced at Jed, and slowly, a cruel grin spread across his face. Tell your friends to saddle up. Back in the saloon, Ellie poured herself a drink, though her thoughts were far from the whiskey in her glass. She had seen the way Frank looked at her before he left. She knew what men like him did when they were beaten. Sam, the bartender, stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. Ellie, you should leave town. Tonight. He'll be back. And he won't be alone. Ellie exhaled slowly, setting her glass down. She could run, disappear, like she'd done before. But something deep inside her refused. Instead, her fingers brushed against the shotgun resting against the bar, and a slow, knowing smile touched her lips. Let him try. The wind howled through the empty streets of Coyote's Rest, kicking up dust under the dim glow of lanterns. The town had gone quiet, as if sensing the storm about to break. Inside the saloon, Ellie sat near the bar, calm, but alert, her fingers lightly tapping against the wooden surface. She knew how this worked. Frank Boyle wasn't smart enough to let this go. He'd be coming. And he wouldn't be alone. Outside, Frank and Jed rode under the cover of darkness, leading 3 other men, Killian Sykes, Wade Galloway, and Clay Dorsey, all hired guns with no loyalty, no conscience, just a love for easy money and blood. The kind of men who thrived on ambushes, on overwhelming numbers. And tonight, Ellie Carter was their target. Frank's eyes burned with hatred as he gripped the reins. We go in fast, take her down before she even knows what's happening, he muttered. She's just one girl. Ain't no way she can take us all. But Ellie knew they were coming. She had seen too many men like Frank, prideful, predictable, reckless. She had spent her childhood watching her father outsmart bounty hunters, outshoot lawmen, outlive the kind of men who thought numbers made them invincible. And if Frank thought he was about to walk into that saloon and take her by surprise, well, he was in for a hell of a disappointment. The doors of the saloon creaked open slowly, and the 5 men stepped inside, guns already drawn. The room was nearly empty, just Ellie sitting at the bar, a bottle of whiskey in front of her, her back turned to them. Too easy, Frank thought. He took a step closer, his voice dripping with triumph. Not so tough now, are you, Carter? Ellie exhaled slowly, took a sip of her drink, then set the glass down with a soft clink. She didn't turn around. Didn't need to. Instead, she simply said, "You sure about that?" The moment Frank realized his mistake, it was too late. From the shadows of the saloon, the sound of rifles being cocked cut through the silence like a knife. Sam, the bartender, and 3 other regulars, men who had seen enough of Frank's bullying, stood up from their hiding places, their weapons trained on the gang. Ellie finally turned, her shotgun resting casually in her lap, her expression unreadable. Frank had walked straight into her trap. For a moment, nobody moved. The air inside the saloon had turned ice-cold, thick with the kind of tension that made men reconsider their life choices. Frank Boyle's cocky grin faded as his eyes darted across the room, taking in the rifle barrels aimed at him and his men. He had walked into a trap, and he damn well knew it. Ellie Carter, still sitting at the bar, her shotgun resting lazily in her lap, looked completely at ease. As if this was all just another quiet night. Jed Turner, still limping, shifted nervously, his hand twitching near his holster. "Frank, maybe we oughta." "Shut up, Jed." Frank's voice was sharp, but there was an edge of panic beneath it. He was trapped. If he reached for his gun, he'd be dead before his fingers even touched the grip. His men weren't much better off. Killian, Wade, and Clay stood stiff, their eyes flicking between Ellie and the rifles trained on them. None of them had expected this. Ellie finally stood, slow and deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. She took a step forward, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. Frank swallowed hard. The woman he had mocked, threatened, and tried to kill was now standing over him, and for the first time, he was afraid. Ellie tilted her head slightly. "What's wrong, Frank? You were real brave an hour ago. What changed?" Her voice was low, measured, dangerous. Frank licked his lips, his pride and fear battling for control. He could fight, go down in a blaze of gunfire like a fool, or he could live. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to meet Ellie's gaze. "This ain't over, Carter." Ellie smirked. "Yeah, it is." Then, with an almost casual flick of her shotgun, she gestured toward the door. "Get. And don't let me see your face in this town again." The entire saloon held its breath as Frank and his men hesitated. Then, one by one, they backed toward the exit, beaten without a single shot fired. Ellie didn't move until the doors swung shut behind them. Then, finally, she let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders. It was over. For now. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets as Frank Boyle and his men disappeared into the night, their boots kicking up dust as they walked toward their horses. No one in town stopped them. No one dared. They had come in looking for revenge and had left with their tails between their legs. Frank's face was rigid with humiliation, his hands clenched so tight his nails nearly broke the skin. He had never been beaten without a fight before. But this wasn't just a loss. This was a warning. Back inside the Coyote's Rest Saloon, Ellie Carter set her shotgun down, exhaling slowly. The danger had passed, but something in her gut told her this wasn't finished. Men like Frank Boyle didn't forget nights like this. They let their rage fester, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had seen it before. And if she knew anything, it was that men who ran away always came back. The only question was when. Sam, the bartender, poured her another drink, his hands steady but his expression tense. "You shoulda killed him, Ellie," he muttered. "Men like Frank don't learn. They just wait." Ellie took the glass, rolling the whiskey between her fingers before taking a slow sip. "I know, Sam," she said quietly. Her father would have finished the job. William Carter never let his enemies walk away. But she wasn't her father. The saloon was nearly empty now. The men who had backed Ellie up had returned to their drinks, but they weren't celebrating. They knew how the West worked. This wasn't the kind of thing that ended clean. Frank had too much pride to let this go. And next time, he wouldn't just bring a few men, he'd bring an army. Ellie stood, stretching out her shoulders. She had a choice to make. She could leave town, vanish before Frank had the chance to return. Or she could stay, face him when he came back. She already knew which option she'd choose. She had been running for too long. It was time to make a stand. As she walked toward the door, the bartender called after her. "Where you goin'?" Ellie glanced back, her expression unreadable. "To get ready, Sam. Next time, they won't be walking out." Then, with the weight of an inevitable battle hanging in the air, she stepped into the cold night, ready for whatever came next. The night air was sharp against Ellie Carter's skin as she stepped onto the wooden porch of the Coyote's Rest Saloon. The town was quiet now, but she could feel the storm coming. Frank Boyle wasn't the type to lick his wounds and move on. He'd be back, and next time, he wouldn't come with just 4 men. No, Frank would want to erase the memory of his humiliation with blood and bullets. And Ellie knew exactly what that meant. He wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. She walked toward the small boarding house where she rented a room, her boots echoing through the empty street. Her mind was already calculating. She needed to be ready. Ammunition. Reinforcements. A plan. She had the advantage of knowing this town, knowing its blind spots and vantage points. But she couldn't take on a whole gang alone. Not even a Carter could win a gunfight against overwhelming numbers. And so, she had a decision to make. Fight alone or find people willing to stand beside her. At dawn, She rode out to the old homestead ruins just outside town, a place she hadn't visited in years. Her father's hideout. The cabin was nothing but a skeleton now, the wood rotting, the roof half caved in, but buried beneath the floorboards was a stash her father had left behind, a chest full of weapons, extra ammunition, and a few stacks of cash. Ellie pried it open, dust swirling in the golden morning light. Inside, she found exactly what she needed, a set of Colt revolvers, a repeating rifle, and a leather gun belt that once belonged to Black Jack Carter himself. She strapped the belt around her waist, adjusting the weight of the guns at her hips. It felt natural, familiar, like slipping into a life she had tried to leave behind. She had spent years convincing herself that she was different from her father, that she could escape his shadow. But as she stood there, fully armed, she knew there was no outrunning blood. By midday, she was back in town, gathering the few people she trusted. Sam, the bartender. 2 ranch hands who had no love for outlaws. An old sharpshooter who owed her father a favor. They sat around a table in the now empty saloon, a crude map of the town spread before them. Ellie laid out the plan, where they would position themselves, where Frank's men were likely to come from, how to funnel them into a kill zone. If Frank was bringing an army, she'd make sure they walked into a damn massacre. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, the tension settled over the town like a thick fog. Everything was in place. Ellie stood at the front of the saloon, arms crossed, her revolvers resting easy on her hips. She wasn't afraid. If Frank wanted a war, she'd give him one. And this time, only one of them would walk away. The sun had barely risen when the sound of hoofbeats thundered in the distance. Dust rose along the horizon, a dark cloud moving fast toward Coyote's rest. Ellie Carter stood at the entrance of the saloon, fingers resting lightly on the grips of her revolvers. This was it. Frank Boyle was coming, and this time, he wasn't hiding his intentions. He wanted blood. From the rooftops, Sam and the sharpshooter took their positions, rifles at the ready. Down near the general store, the ranch hands crouched behind barrels, their weapons drawn. The town was empty. Anyone with sense had fled or locked themselves inside. The silence was heavy, the kind that came before the first gunshot split the air. Ellie exhaled slowly, her heartbeat steady. Frank and his men, a dozen riders, mean-looking bastards with murder in their eyes, came galloping into town, stopping just outside the saloon. Frank swung down from his horse, his face twisted with anger. "You should have run, Carter," he spat, his hand hovering near his holster. "Now you're gonna die right where you stand." Ellie smirked. "You first." Frank went for his gun. The world slowed. Ellie's hands moved like lightning, drawing both revolvers and firing before Frank even cleared leather. The bullet struck his chest, sending him staggering backward. And then, chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded from every direction. Ellie dove behind a barrel, taking out 2 of Frank's men with precise shots. From the rooftops, Sam's rifle cracked, dropping another outlaw. The ranch hands held their ground, picking off riders before they could dismount. The air filled with smoke and the screams of wounded men. Ellie reloaded, her hands moving on instinct. One by one, Frank's men fell. Some tried to flee, but Ellie's people cut them down before they could escape. And then, silence. The dust settled. The battle was over. Frank Boyle lay dying in the dirt, his breaths ragged, eyes filled with hate. Ellie knelt beside him, her gun still in her hand. Frank coughed, blood on his lips. You're just like him." Ellie stared at him for a long moment, then stood. "No. He would have made you suffer. I'm just finishing what you started." She aimed once more. One last shot. And then, Frank Boyle was gone. The fight was over. The town was safe. But Ellie knew one thing for certain. Peace never lasted long in the West. She holstered her guns, took a deep breath, and walked into the sunrise. She was a Carter. And this was just another day.